So a few years ago, I was at a Christian leadership conference, much like this one. And on the final night, one of the keynote speakers got up, and someone who had a bunch of books to sell out in the lobby, this hip, young-looking academic. And they got up to speak in front of this packed auditorium. And this is what they said. In 1909, the Blacksmith's Journal, the official organ of the International Brotherhood of Blacksmiths and Helpers, it urged blacksmiths to usher in a new era by securing at least one additional recruit for the Blacksmiths Union. And in the following months, the journal reported some limited success in this mission. But within a generation, the blacksmith trade was defunct. Henry Ford, just a few years later, would begin to mass produce cars and tractors and trucks and revolutionize the transportation industry. And blacksmiths, well, they were forced to adapt to this shift in culture or else get left behind. Most of them didn't. And in fact, that next year, that same journal reissued that same challenge, but a little bit more frantically. They wrote, if everyone would just secure just one more person into the fold, what a mighty organization we would be. But instead, blacksmiths faded into obscurity. Now, don't worry, you didn't come to some weird blacksmith-themed Christian leadership conference. And I swear to you, I am not just going to give someone else's talk this morning. That's what you have YouTube for. But the point of that person's talk was that the church in its ministry needed to adapt to the changes in culture. That faith communities and congregations, they needed to throw off the shackles of their stodgy old tradition and embrace the new and the novel and the revolutionary. We couldn't be like the blacksmiths, convinced that automobiles were just a fad. That if we stuck to our guns and we waited it out and we pulled just a few more people into our special little club, that we would be just fine. We needed to be the sort of bold, decisive leaders that would usher in a new era for the church that got shit done for the kingdom of God. And I gotta tell you, everyone in that auditorium was pumped by this talk. We gave this person a standing ovation, and we flooded into that lobby of that auditorium, and we bought the books and the classes and the seminars, and then we went back to the hotel bar, and we drank overpriced domestic draft beer, and we patted each other on the back, and we congratulated ourselves, and we talked about how we were going to go back to our churches, and we were going to move the pews into a circle in our worship space, and we were going to drag them into the future, kicking and screaming if need be. And if those old people couldn't get on board with our edgy new way of doing things, well, screw them. Because they needed to adapt to the times. They needed to innovate. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a church left in the future. I've worked at mainline denominational institutional church in my entire adult life. And look, I get it. If there was ever a place where the winds of change needed to blow, it would be in the pews and the fellowship centers and the committee meetings of nearly every Presbyterian, Baptist, and Lutheran church in this country. But I've been at my current church now for like 8 years. And I gotta say, in that time, I've begun to love and care for and maybe even like a little bit the people that I serve. And even though we find ourselves in the middle of a market that is oversaturated with marketing gurus and professional ministry coaches and superstar pastors that are all promising us the next big thing, the 3 simple steps to turn our dying churches around. I got to tell you, I've been asking myself just more and more lately. What about the blacksmiths? What about the artisans and the craftsmen who loved and cultivated love in others for the smell of hot iron as it's quenched in oil, or for the sound of metal hitting metal? What about the people who didn't want to or even couldn't change to the new way of doing things? What about the ushers and the altar guild members and the liturgists and the bulletin folders and the Christmas pageant directors? What about the blacksmiths in our faith communities, the people that have been the very lifeblood of our church for the better part of at least of this last century? We're going to hear a lot about innovation this weekend. I just know it. We're going to hear about how we need to embrace it, and how we need to look forward into the future, and how we need to prepare ourselves for the oncoming revolution of digital churches and decentralized campuses and taking ancient practices and wrapping them in new wrappers and being churches that are committed to things that the stodgy old traditions never were. But before we do that, before we dive into that pool, could we just take a second as church leaders? Could we just take one moment to ask ourselves, are we doing enough to address the pain that comes with irrelevancy? Sometimes I think we as faith leaders, we forget that there is a human cost to our constant, self-gratifying focus on the new and the novel. I mean, in a culture that is obsessed with innovation and the next big thing, what does it mean for those of us that are part of a faith tradition that has so resolutely and so often been counter-cultural? Why is it that so many of us are clamoring at the altar of change, willingly flinging the bodies of the past onto the fire for the sake of the sacrifice to progress? And look, I get it. The times, they are a-changin'. And the church must change with them. But that doesn't mean that this is some zero-sum game with winners on the right and losers on the left. In fact, I would say that it is the obligation of us as faith leaders to carve out grace-filled, compassionate spaces for everyone, including the people who are in the twilight of their time as the dominant culture. A few years back, my own church went through a difficult, contentious, divisive time. We decided to change our church bulletins. And for those of you that don't know what a church bulletin is, it's a program that features the order of worship and a few announcements. In most churches, it's typically about 2 pages long, but somehow at our church over the years, our church bulletin ballooned to be like 14 pages, and include the order of worship and announcements for every single event that was coming up, and a full calendar of events for every committee, small group, and class that was coming up in the next few months, and much more. And I'm really convinced that we were single-handedly responsible for the deforestation of at least 1, maybe 2 Amazon rainforests. All those dead orangutans. And, yeah, too real for you? Yeah. And there was a day when we, as forward-thinking automaker leaders that we were on the church staff where we decided that we were going to cut down on the paper waste, where we were going to save on the labor costs, and we were going to switch our bulletin to a digital format that people could access on their phones. I know. I also now see that that was a bad idea. I mean, the people in my church are like, the median age is like 60 years old. People revolted. They sent angry emails. They sent anonymous letters. In fact, there was a Sunday where one of the prominent members of our church stood up to our connections director, who has nothing to do with the bulletins, and wagged his finger in her face, and he accused her of alienating the very people who pay her salary, which sounds nothing like a church person, right? And all that time, I was thinking to myself, what the hell? Why can't these old people get with it? Why can't they get with the times? It's just a bulletin. But now I see it wasn't just a bulletin. I mean, it was about bulletins, to be sure, but it was about more than that, right? It was what we were bearing witness to was really blacksmiths in mourning. The world, this different and foreign place, was beginning to seep in to the one place that many of them felt was consistent and safe. And it didn't matter how practical or logical or cost-effective digital bulletins were, because deep down inside, when people encountered it, they knew it was just another sign that the hammer and the anvil and the bellows that they once held on to, the things that they loved, were just relics of an outdated past, and them along with it. We see it all the time in our churches, right? Every time we suggest that maybe we can do away with the old, outdated, stale songs and replace them with new and fresh and maybe even theologically more accurate songs. Or when we move to cancel a class or a small group that has long since outlived its relevancy. Or maybe even when we suggest to the altar guild ladies that maybe this year, just maybe, they don't have to hang up those ugly felt banners that they do every single Easter. It's a painful thing. But if we could figure out how to honor those people, if we could figure out how to honor our past, we might find that is an essential part of what it means to prepare for our future. And so this morning, I just want to offer up, as I close, just 3 considerations that we might be able to make in our own context, our own ministry areas, as we find ourselves with our thumb above the button of whatever next big thing we think is going to save our churches. Whenever we, and look, they're not, this isn't a magic bullet or 3 simple things that you can do to change your church by Sunday, or I'm not selling any books today, but they're just gentle suggestions of things that you should think about whenever you feel yourself deconstructing or destroying the old to make way for the new. And the first is, does this thing need a little bit more time and space before we make this transition? Is there a more gradual, nuanced approach we could take? Could our 12-month plan really be 18 or 24 months? And maybe in doing so, open up some space for people to acclimate in a better way. And maybe even see some early fruits of things that we promised them. The second thing that we can do, the second consideration we should make, really, is who are the people that are mourning? Who are the blacksmiths in our congregations? Name them. Because I think oftentimes we hurt people in ways that we don't imagine or intend. And if we can identify them, then maybe we, like Job's friends in the biblical story, can sit next to them in their pile of ashes as they go through this profound loss. And sometimes all we need to do is bear witness to and validate the pain that they're feeling. Even if we can't or we won't do anything about what's causing them so much pain. And also, and this is a freebie, but is there a way that we can create more grateful, grace-filled exits for the people in our faith communities who feel like they can't continue to come to our churches because it isn't their home anymore, rather than letting them slip out the back silently and unnoticed? And the final thing that we can do, final consideration that we can make, is ask ourselves, are there places in our churches where we can still honor our blacksmiths? And I don't mean that we put them on the automotive assembly line to attach rotors to axles, because they're not going to be good at that. I mean, how can we find ways to honor these people in ways that don't patronize or harm them? Because I think in our society, even today, despite the passage of time, there are still corners of our culture that do honor blacksmiths. The hobbyist communities, the living history museums, the places, the niche markets, and the people who are looking for artisan pieces of work. And likewise, can we find the corners of the church where people's skills and gifts and talents, the things that they love to do, the things that they're good at doing, can still be utilized? Friends, I believe with all my heart, and on the best days, like many of you, that the kingdom of God is a place where everyone is invited and welcomed and embraced. And that means the innovators and the tradition keepers. That means the blacksmiths and the automakers, the online pastors and the old school reverends. And if we can figure out how to create that space, maybe we will find that we are blessed in that space when we ourselves are the blacksmiths in the room. May we, as church leaders, certainly and definitely, boldly lead our tribes into whatever this unknown future holds for us. But in the meantime, may we also hold tightly and honor our past. Thank you.